Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Diego Samuel Thermal Shock Process Colombia from Colonna Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Colonna, based out of Bristol, England, and this coffee right here was featured in our most recent blind taste test rankings video. It's part of a viewer subscriber recommendation suggestion series where it did finish second place out of 6 coffees. And Colonna was a suggestion to us by Colin Hong and Sam Griffiths. So shout out to and thank you to Colin and Sam for the suggestion. And Colonna is a coffee roaster I had never tried before that blind taste test rankings video. They're a coffee roaster I had heard of when I was out in England and was doing some research to see where I might want to visit for coffee. I just could not justify the trip out to Bristol for one coffee roaster. But I have quite a bit of familiarity with Diego's coffees, as we've reviewed a number of Diego's coffees on this channel. So it's going to be interesting to see how it compared to those. This right here is day 56 of this coffee. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 205 degrees Fahrenheit through the Aeropress. We'll get into why that was a little bit later, but as a result, the grind is a more fine grind, even more fine than the V60. And roast profile, it's very tricky. I mean, it's lighter than most English coffees we've had. It's by far not the lightest thing we've ever had, so hopefully that gives you a good indication of where this coffee was. But with that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 39, which was that blind taste test rankings day, and if you watched that video, then you saw that we were able to tell this coffee because right from the start, the moment you open the bag, the moment you grind the beans, I mean, every step of this coffee just radiated cinnamon, and of course the taste came out a very strong cinnamon, and we could tell that it was this cup of coffee just from the aroma of the coffee itself. And I kind of had mixed feelings on that, and we'll get into why that was right here on the second day, which was day 46. And that was because it kind of felt like an artificial cinnamon sugar in a sense. So for anybody that's ever tried one of those flavored coffees, most specifically a cinnamon flavored coffee, that's kind of what it tasted like on those early days for me. And as a result, even though I could tell that it was, better quality and a little better, it still just kind of brought me back to those weird coffees that I'd had in the past. I was picking up on some secondary characteristics, including a slight funkiness, which I'll be honest, I appreciated because it was nice to have a secondary factor in this cup of coffee. It was so cinnamon forward and direct that anything else I was able to pick from this coffee was always going to be an added bonus. But slight bit of strong mango, and then still pretty mixed feelings on this cup to this point. And I went to the V60, and it was pretty consistent. I mean, alternating between the V60 and the Chemex, especially in the early days, wasn't seeing too many changes. Some additional characteristics, including a little bit of a heavier chocolate. This is when the coffee felt the most heavy from any of these days, so that's the positive of the V60, I suppose. Day 50, still looking for some additional factors in this cup to kind of complement and maybe even contrast that super strong cinnamon, but right off the bat, I mean, it just radiates cinnamon. And there's a fair bit of acidity, including some slight smokiness, and it was pretty sweet. That was to be expected, very straightforward cinnamon in it. And whatever that additional fruit we were experiencing wasn't present on this day either, so I mean, it was making its presence felt sometimes, but not necessarily on other times, so can't necessarily explain that one. Day 51, coffee hasn't and was likely to change much, especially given when it had been roasted, and even alternating through these brew methods, we weren't seeing too many changes, but we're still getting some different results here and there, super heavy cinnamon and a fair bit of lasting acidity in the finish, but I was beginning to like this coffee a little less and less for being a little too one note, a little too one-dimensional, and still kind of feeling a little bit artificial for me. Day 52, ran it through the Aeropress, and we'd mentioned for all the other coffees we had one specific day dedicated to the Aeropress for all of these coffees, and this is the standout day, and I really enjoyed this coffee for a number of reasons brewed through the Aeropress, including the fact that it felt just a little bit more direct, and it felt a little bit more void of all these extras that we were experiencing. So maybe a slight bit of this funkiness, smokiness, and chocolate. It just felt a little bit more defined as a whole, and most notably that artificial sense that the coffee had felt, it felt a little bit more clear of a cinnamon, and that was a huge selling point to me because it just made me feel like this was an actual cup of coffee as opposed to an artificial cinnamon flavored cup of coffee, and felt it was actually quite decent. A slight bit of fleshy fruits in the finish, and I've been saying that any other secondary characteristic I could get from this cup of coffee was going to be a huge positive. So I ran it back on day 54 to see if it was a one-off or see if it was actually the way the coffee was through the Aeropress, and again, I was kind of impressed by the way it came out in the Aeropress. Direct, defined, harboring a lot of the intense cinnamon flavor while keeping it in a more what I described as realistic manner, and felt a lot cleaner and just pretty decent overall that way. And this one was also brewed through the Aeropress, and I settled on this coffee was just significantly better through the Aeropress. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we were getting. All right, and 2 level 5s, and they won't come as a shock to anybody, and it's the sweetness and the spice. And the spice, of course, are representing the cinnamon, which this is the most cinnamon cup of coffee I've ever had in my entire life by far. And it's one of those things where this is a relative tasting wheel, so it could be even somewhere as high as a 6. But the sweetness, it's a pretty sweet cup of coffee, not too surprising there either. Definitely justified at that level 5. This tasting wheel was also made with the Aeropress, so just keep that in mind. And the finish at a level 4, it does have a really lasting finish, but it's not as overbearing as you might have expected given just how cinnamon forward this cup of coffee is. And then the cleanliness, it's surprisingly clean, especially through the Aeropress for exactly what it is. So credit on those things right there. But there isn't too much else in this cup of coffee. They do have listed on here that it's complex and it's floral, and it's by far not the most floral cup of coffee for me. I mean, I only put that at a level 2. And acidity lower at level 2. Other brew methods, you're bumping that up. It's probably a level 3 through both the Aeropress, both the V60 and the Chemex. And then a slight bit of chocolate and a slight bit of stone fruit and a very slight bit of citrus, but the chocolate and stone fruit both at a level 3. Probably a little generous on both of those, but given just how minimal everything else was in this cup of coffee, other than the cinnamon, something like that is going to just feel a little bit stronger than it actually is because, I mean, it was one of the few things that you were able to get in addition to the cinnamon. Bitter and smoky, lower, mentioned that the Aeropress really cut down on those two things. And the body on the lower side, I mean, it's at a level 2 for brewed through the Aeropress and for being a Colombian coffee. So that right there is interesting in itself, but I actually quite like the way that this tasting wheel looks. The way I'm drinking the coffee today, it looks a lot like how I would chart this tasting wheel as well. So my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee, I mean, I figured it out by the end, a sense that I would really enjoy this coffee more than I had from the start. But even then, it wasn't necessarily going to be my favorite cup of coffee, as being completely honest, it felt a little too one-note. It felt a little too direct. And for a coffee that was labeled and marketed as complex, it just kind of honed in on that one factor specifically, that cinnamon. And anytime I was able to get any sort of secondary components, I said, okay, this is better. I mean, this is enjoyable. But the fact that I had to work through this coffee so hard to get it to a point where I thought that this was a really good cup of coffee, not necessarily going to be my favorite thing. But even then, I mean, it's interesting. It's an interesting cup of coffee. Having something this cinnamon forward, it's interesting, and it's by far the most interesting of these 6 coffees that we had reviewed. And by the end, through the Aeropress, it could have been my favorite, maybe my second favorite coffee from those 6 that I tried. It's just a little, I don't know, it is too one-note for me. But the type of person I would suggest this coffee to, and I had a very hard time thinking of this because I love cinnamon, and having something that was just so cinnamon direct without any other additional characteristics to it was a little bit of a hard sell for me. So I think maybe just keep in mind that if you maybe perhaps like the artificial flavored cinnamon coffees, then this is a much better version of those coffees. But at the same time, it does have, I don't know, that nice kind of modern coffee feel to it. It's different, it's out there. So maybe somebody that likes something that's a little bit more different and out there, most notably specifically looking for that cinnamon, then this seems like a pretty decent fit. But for the most part, I think that's what I got, and I think that's the best way I can leave this review. If you've by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee or anything else from Colonna, would love to know your thoughts and impressions of it or them as well. I do hope to try something else from them in the future, as I know that this one was a wild one to try for a first impression of a coffee roaster, so I'll definitely be looking out for them in the future as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Diego Samuel Thermal Shock Processed Colombia from Colonna Coffee. Thank you for watching.